Hello, everybody. Okay, so tonight, I'm doing something a little different tonight. It's not kind of my normal teaching style, but there's been some people that have come across my path that have expressed that they find it hard to read their Bible for one reason or another. Either it's kind of hard to follow, maybe a little too confusing, which might be as easy as getting a different translation, or they can't stay focused in it. It's not keeping their attention. So I thought, the thing that we all long for is to feel connected. And so I thought, if I can connect these people with the men that wrote these books and tell them who these guys were, where they were, why they wrote the book, who they wrote the book to, then just maybe they'll be excited to read the book because they feel like they know these people. So tonight I'm going to teach you, I only have time for 3, but we're going to go start with Matthew. And I hope by the end of tonight, I know most of you have already read the book of Matthew, maybe many, many times, but I hope that by the end of the night, if you read it again, you'll pick up on things maybe you haven't picked up on before. So Matthew, the first book of the New Testament, everybody knows this. He was one of the original 12 disciples of Jesus, and he walked with Jesus during his 3.5-year ministry up until his crucifixion. Many commentaries state that Matthew's book was written to Jewish Christians. Did you guys know that the word Christian was not originally a good thing?
Yes. Right.
Yes. According to the Vine's Expository Bible Dictionary, I want to read you this definition. It says, the name Christians was applied by Gentiles, and there was no doubt and implication of scorn. Tacitus, writing near the end of the 1st century, says, the vulgar call them Christians. The author or origin of this denomination, Christos, which is Christ, had in the reign of Tiberius been executed by Procurator Pontius Pilate. From the 2nd century onward, the term was accepted by believers as a title of honor. A lot of people don't know that. They think that Christians always was a good word. It was a tag of you're a Christ follower, and it didn't start out being a good thing. But Roman Emperor Tiberius' name is mentioned here. He was Rome's 2nd emperor, and he reigned from 14 AD to 37. Now, Christ was crucified in the spring, according to the New Exhaustive Strong's Concordance. He was crucified in the spring of 30 AD. So Roman Emperor Tiberius was the Roman emperor in charge during Christ's adult ministry, and his name is mentioned here. But the term Christian wasn't used until well after Christ was crucified. In Acts 11:25 through 28, it says, and he, Barnabas, left for Tarsus and took Saul. And when he had found him, he brought him to Antioch. And for an entire year they met with the church and taught considerable numbers. And the disciples were first called Christians in Antioch. Now at this time some prophets came down from Jerusalem to Antioch. One of them, named Agabus, stood up and began to indicate by the Spirit that there would certainly be a great famine all over the world. And this took place in the reign of Claudius. So if you're catching these emperors' names, they're literally giving us a time frame of when these things happened. So Christ was alive during the reign of Tiberius. Claudius was Rome's 4th emperor, and he reigned from 41 AD to 54. So it was between, if Christ was crucified in 30, it was 11 to 24 years after the crucifixion when they started calling Christians, Christians. And so I thought that was very interesting, but it was a term of scorn to them. It didn't become their badge of honor until later. So back to Matthew. Everybody in here know what Matthew was before he was a Christ follower? Tax collector. In Matthew 9:9 it says, and Jesus went out from there. He saw a man called Matthew sitting in the tax collector's booth. And he said to him, follow me. And he got up and he followed him. Jesus picked a tax collector. And if you know anything about tax collectors back then, he was a Jew, but he worked for the Roman government. And he made his money by collecting taxes from his own people. And most of the tax collectors over-collected, and they kept what was off of the top, for they made themselves rich by over-collecting from their very own people. Tax collectors were despised people within their people because they were working for the Romans. And so Matthew was not a popular guy. And so for Jesus to pick Matthew was just kind of like why would you pick him? And Matthew opened up his heart. He opened up his home right away. He left everything to follow after Jesus, and he invited him to his house, and he introduced him to some of his tax collector buddies, and some versions say like prostitutes were there just mingling around. And the Pharisees had a fit when they saw Jesus with this group. And because to them, a Pharisee was like, if you hang with a tax collector, not only are you tarnishing your reputation, but you would be guilty by association. And they weren't even allowed, tax collectors weren't allowed to be witnesses. They weren't allowed to be judges because they were so dishonest. So here's Matthew. He's like, oh, you picked me? Okay, so he leaves everything to follow after Jesus. Matthew had two names. Matthew was actually his Greek name, and Levi was his Hebrew name. Now, Matthew called himself by his Greek name because he worked for Greek-speaking Romans. But if you read Mark and Luke's rendition of the same story, they call him Levi. And so in Mark 2:14, it says, as he passed by, he saw Levi, the son of Alphaeus, sitting in the tax booth, and he said to him, follow me. And he got up and he followed him. Matthew refers to himself as Matthew. Mark and Luke refer to him initially as Levi, but these are one and the same guys. Now here's what Matthew starts with. If you've ever, opened up Matthew 1 and you're like, good grief, what am I looking at? It's the legal genealogy of Jesus. Now remember, Matthew is a tax collector, so he would write things that concerned legal matters like birthrights, inheritances. So it's only fitting that Matthew would do Jesus' legal genealogy. He wants to emphasize that Jesus comes from Jewish heritage. He's the son of Abraham, but royally, he is the son of King David, and the Jews would have found that of utmost importance. But what Matthew does is he throws in a couple women's names in this genealogy, which was not what the Jewish people were used to. He throws in the name of, he's got, I know them all, where I have them in my notes, Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba, and then he throws in Mary. They don't put women's names usually in Jewish genealogies, but Matthew is basically like just setting the groundwork for this Jesus is going to change things up. And this kingdom of heaven, this kingdom on earth that he's going to establish goes a lot bigger than your Jewish kingdom. So get ready, because he's about to make things new. So many think that Jesus' biological genealogy is found in Matthew. That's not his biological one, because if you look in Matthew closely, you'll see that it starts with Abraham. It goes to King David, then it goes to his son Solomon, then it comes down to Jacob, the father of Joseph, and then Joseph, supposedly, or for all legal purposes, was the father of Jesus, but we know that Joseph wasn't the father of Jesus. Legally he was, but biologically he was the son of the Holy Spirit. So in order to find that genealogy, you have to go to a different book. But a lot of people think that that's Jesus' biological genealogy in Matthew. It's not. It's his legal one. So, Matthew begins with the birth of Jesus. Now you guys are going to learn a lot about the Jewish calendar in this teaching. But Matthew begins with his birth. And the New Strong's Exhaustive Concordance states that Jesus was born between 5 and 4 BC. Now that'll throw a lot of people into a tailspin, because they're like, BC means before Christ, and AD means Anno Domini, the year of our Lord. So 0, he had to been, that's where the calendars got messed up. Strong's Concordance has him born at 5/4 BC. And we can validate this because King Herod the Great sent out the decree to kill all the male babies that were 2 and under, and Herod the Great died in the spring of 4 BC. So it would have been impossible from his grave to send out a decree anytime after that. So Jesus had to have been born in 4 BC, 5 BC, or 6 BC for that to make sense. And the Strong's Concordance has him between 5 and 4 BC. So Matthew focuses on Jesus' 3.5-year ministry on this earth. One thing we have to understand, and I'm going to hit it twice tonight, the Jewish calendar doesn't run like ours. Ours runs January 1st to January 1st, and the year switches over January 1st. The Jewish civil calendar switches over in September, October. So I looked up when will their new year be this year, sometime about September 10th or 11th. They're going to switch over into 2019. We're still 2018. So the civil calendar for the Jewish people, their new year falls in the fall. And we know that Jesus was baptized in the fall. So we have to wonder, now that we know the civil new year falls in the fall, now your brain starts to turn and you're like, okay, let's see if we can figure out some more stuff about maybe when he was born. We know he was born in the fall. We know he was crucified in the spring 3.5 years later. Now we know that New Year's Day for the civil calendar falls possibly right around the birth and the baptism of Jesus. So I'm going to try to get to the bottom of some of these dates for you guys tonight. The reason that people think that Jesus died in 33 AD, because there's a big group that say he died in 33 AD, is because they think he was born at 0.
Right.
And we know that he was crucified when he was 33 and a half. But now that you know he was born somewhere in 5 or 4 BC, we now know that he died when he was 33 and a half. He died in the spring of 30 AD. All right, so the last words that Matthew penned in his book was the Great Commission, where he said, go into all the nations, preach the gospel. And it says, I promise I'm going to be with you till the end of the age. Now that phraseology, the end of the age, is questionable to some people. They don't know what is the end of the age. Has it already happened? Did that happen back then? Because he promised the disciples he would be with them even to the end of the age. Well, I looked up that phrase, and it's been used 6 times in the New American Standard Bible. And I'm going to read you what the end of the age is in these verses. The first one is Daniel 12:13. And it says, but as for you, Daniel, go your ways to the end. Then you will enter into rest and rise again for your allotted portion at the end of the age. So we know at the end of the age, whenever it might be, I'm going to tell you, but Daniel is going to rise, and he is going to claim his allotted portion of something, which I know is the millennial kingdom. So that's one thing that's going to happen at the end of the age. And then Jesus starts talking about a parable about wheat and the tares. Tares being the children of the devil, and wheat being the children of God. And he uses that phraseology, the end of the age, 3 times in that one parable. And it's found in Matthew 13, verse 39 and 40, and then 49. I'm just going to read those 3 verses. And the enemy who sowed them, the tares, is the devil, and the harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are the angels. So just as the tares are gathered up and burned with fire, so shall it be at the end of the age. And then verse 49. So it will be at the end of the age that the angels will come forth and take out the wicked from among the righteous. So this all happens at the end of the age. There's going to be a reaping of wicked people that happens during this end of the age phraseology time. I know when it takes place, and I will tell you, it takes place in Revelation right before Christ returns for his bride. There is a reaping of the harvest of a wicked people before that happens. Matthew 24:3 is the next time he uses that phraseology, and it says, as he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately saying, tell us, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Now here's where we get into some tricky scriptures. If you look at the headings of chapter 23 in Matthew versus the heading of chapter 24, you will see that Jesus is changing topic on these disciples. He started out in the temple complex, and he's condemning the Pharisees for shutting up the kingdom of heaven, for killing the prophets that he sent to save their souls. And he says, upon you is going to be the blood of the righteous saints that you've killed. And it's going to happen in your generation. And I tell you, this house is going to be left unto you desolate. And you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he that comes in the name of the Lord. And when I looked up that word desolate, one would think it means destroyed. And your house is Jerusalem. Like your Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. And that's actually what does happen. But when I looked up that word desolate, it means your house is going to be left without my presence and my power and my aid. And I'm like, okay, he's getting ready to just leave them to their own vices. But they think, okay, it's going to be destroyed. And then he walks away with his disciples, and they go towards the Mount of Olives, and they're looking over the temple complex. And Jesus says, I tell you, not one stone's going to be left upon each other. And so the disciples are all thinking all of this is going to happen in their lifetime. And so a couple of the disciples ask him three very pointed, specific questions. And the questions are, tell us, when will these things happen? What will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? So because the questions are so specific, Jesus doesn't give them answers to things that are going to happen in their lifetime, because he's not coming back in their lifetime. The end of the age will not be in their lifetime. But they asked him, what's the sign of your coming and when's the end of the age? So he answers accordingly. And you read Matthew 24 and you'll find out what those answers are. I'm going to let you read Matthew 24. And you can find out what those answers are. But those things happen. They haven't happened yet. They happen at the end of the age. They happen in the book of Revelation. Matthew 28:20. Teaching them to observe all that I commanded you, and lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. All right, so these are all verses that use the end of the age. You want to know what it is in the Thayer's Greek English Lexicon, which is the Bible dictionary. Age, Greek word Strong's G165 is pronounced aion, and it is the end, or rather the consummation of the age preceding Christ's return, which means happening right before Christ's return, with which will be connected three events. Number one, the resurrection of the dead. Number two, the final judgment. And number three, the demolition of this world and its restoration to a more excellent condition. Those three things will happen, all connected with that phrase, the end of the age. Guys, has the earth been destroyed and renovated yet? No. So this is all future prophecy that Matthew is talking about. So Matthew spells out a lot more for this end of the age period, if you catch it, and it's his parables. He put his parables in order from the initiation of the preaching of the gospel to how people are going to receive it when his disciples start preaching, to how they're supposed to live their lives, the struggles that they're going to go through, to the return of Christ, and then the sheep and the goats judgment that happens to determine who goes into the millennial kingdom or not. He's got his parables in a timeline, and you can read them like a story. It's really cool. So although Matthew didn't write the book until years after Christ was crucified, he tells the story of Jesus' life with accountant-like accuracy. Remember, he's a tax collector. He's very good with numbers and just meticulous order. So his chapter, I mean, he's writing to the Jewish people. So he's constantly tying all of his stories back to the Old Testament, because Jewish people know the Old Testament. He's trying to tell them that Messiah that you're looking for, He was him. He came, he went, and he's coming back again at the end of the age. And so he's trying to, like, these Jewish people, he's trying to help them understand he's already come and gone and he's coming back. And if you read Matthew 24, he says when? I'm going to shock some people here. It will be immediately after the tribulation of those days when he will send his angels out to gather the Christians from one end of the earth to the other. Not before, as many people are preaching. Matthew 24 spells it out as clear as day. So in Matthew 23, which was the chapter right before that, like I said, he was prophesying to his disciples and the Pharisees of some coming destruction. And the Jerusalem did get destroyed 40 years after Christ's crucifixion. In the year 70 AD, Jerusalem was destroyed, but that was not the end of the age. So people that feel like, oh, that's all happened. It absolutely has not happened yet. We're not in the end of the age. Matthew 24 tells us what sign to look for that marks the beginning of the tribulation, where the end of the age happens afterwards. In Matthew 24, 15 through 22, this is King James. Then when you therefore shall see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, stand in the holy place. Whoso readeth, let him understand. That is your beginning marking point to the tribulation starting. And he's telling the Jewish people who know good and well what prophecy he's talking about because they know the Old Testament. And then he says, when you see that, then let them which are in Judea flee into the mountains. Let him which is on the housetop not come down to take anything out of his house. Neither let him which is in the field return back to take his clothes. And woe to them that are with child, or to them that give suck in those days. In other words, nursing your babies. Pray that your flight not be in winter, neither on the Sabbath day. For then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time. No, nor ever shall be. And except those days should be shortened, there should no flesh be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened. So the Jews are reading this. They know what the abomination of desolation is. It's that statue, the Antichrist, is going to be placed in the holy place in the temple in Jerusalem. And they're thinking, when we see that, we're supposed to ditch. We're supposed to get out of Jerusalem because the end of the age is coming. Well, here's what happened. Because the disciples thought that Matthew 24 was for them, it's not. It's not for them, but they thought it was. Jesus was actually speaking of tribulation stuff. But because they thought it was, Matthew's warnings in Matthew 24 saved the life of every single Christian living in Jerusalem during the great Jewish-Roman war known as the Great Revolt. When Cestius Gallus from Syria took his soldiers in 66 AD and went down into Jerusalem because there was civil unrest down there and they were trying to help support some troops, he sends his troops down there. The Jews, the Christians, they were in Jerusalem, thought that this was what Matthew was talking about. And it says they all fled Jerusalem. They got out of there. And then shortly after, Nero, who's over in Rome, he's the Roman emperor during the time, sends Vespasian, his general, with their legion of soldiers down into Israel. And they surround the city of Jerusalem. 66 AD. They encompass that city and starve those people for 3.5 years trapped. They can't get out. There's starvation, there's death, there's cannibalism, there's decay. The people that try to get out, they're killing them outside the walls and hanging them on crosses. They're catapulting them back in. It's because the Nero wanted them to keep paying their taxes. The problem was the temple tax wasn't being used for the temple. Nero is having it taken back to Rome and put in pagan temples, and the Jewish people were pitching a fit, and they were revolting. So this was also called the Great Revolt of the Jews. But the sad thing was that they were trapped for 3.5 years inside of the city walls. And by the end of it, Vespasian ended up in 69 having to go back to Rome to take the emperorship because Nero killed himself. And so he left the siege of Jerusalem to his son Titus. And in 70 AD, Titus managed to breach the walls of Jerusalem with the Romans. They ransacked the temple. They took all the treasuries of the temple. They burned it down. They captured tons of Orthodox Jews and imprisoned them. But when it was all said and done, in that 3.5 year span of time, over 1 million Orthodox Jewish people lost their lives. But meanwhile, all the Christians are safe and sound across the Jordan River in Pella and surrounding areas because they thought for the warnings of Matthew 24 were for them, and they got out before the city was encapsulated by the Romans. And here are 4 historic accounts from non-Christian historians of the time talking about this. And one of them says, the whole body, however, of the church at Jerusalem, having been commanded by a divine revelation given to men of approved piety there before the war, removed from the city and dwelt at a certain town beyond the Jordan called Pella. Number 2, Epiphanes also attested to the Christians' escape. According to Bible scholar Adam Clarke, the latter wrote, "It is very remarkable that not a single Christian perished in the destruction of Jerusalem, though there were many there when Cestius Gallus invested the city, and had he persevered in the siege, he would have soon rendered himself master of it. But when he unexpectedly and unaccountably raised the siege, the Christians took that opportunity to escape." Third account, as Vespasian was approaching with his army, all who believed in Christ left Jerusalem and fled to Pella and other places around the Jordan River. And so they all marvelously escaped the general shipwreck of their country. Not one of them perished. And last account, number 4. Pella must not have been the only destination of fleeing Christians, but it was the most prominent at the time. The flight to Pella took place in 66 AD during the attack by Cestius Gallus. Thanks to Matthew's warnings written to Jewish people who thought, oh my goodness, this is the end of the age, took off, and then literally none of them lost their lives during that. But that warning wasn't for them. The warning is for people in the end times. There will be a statue of an Antichrist that will be placed in the rebuilt temple in Jerusalem. And that will be the starting point of the end times tribulation when that actually does take place. The temple will have to be rebuilt at least to the point of the holy place being constructed. All right, so the Orthodox Jews sadly didn't heed the warnings of Matthew because Orthodox Jewish people don't read the New Testament. They live by the Torah, they live by the Old Testament. And sadly, when the real thing happens and the statue does go in, they're not going to heed the warnings of Matthew 24 again, and countless Orthodox Jews are going to be killed during the tribulation period if they don't heed the warnings and get out. So Matthew walks us through the story of Jesus. He tells us how he picked some of his disciples. He tells us how he performed miracles. He writes down what Jesus spoke at the Sermon of the Mount almost like verbatim because he's an accountant. So you got the Sermon on the Mount that is just like you are sitting there listening to Jesus talk, and how we're going to be held at a higher standard, a higher level of accountability than the Mosaic Law could have ever enforced. Now we're going to be judged by our thoughts, not just our actions. And then he quotes Jesus on how we're supposed to treat a brother who sins against us. You know, it's like you're supposed to go to them privately and tell them their fault. And then if they don't listen, then you take somebody with you and you go to them again. And if they don't listen to that, you take it to the church. And if they don't listen to the church, you're supposed to treat them like a pagan and a what? A tax collector, which is what Matthew was. He's like, yeah, if they won't listen, then just treat them like you did me. Treat them like a pagan. Kick them out of the synagogue. You treat them like a tax collector. I thought, how fitting that here's Matthew writing them. So Jesus doesn't always call the equipped. Sometimes he just equips the called, and then he changes them from the inside out, like he did with Matthew, some of the other disciples. But the thing I love about Matthew is that he gave us Jesus' teachings, he gave us Jesus' parables, he gave us Jesus' miracles, and he gave us Jesus' last days on the earth with great detail. And I love details because I just love details. So now, according to church tradition, because there's only one disciple in the Bible that actually told us how he died, and that would be James. But according to church tradition, I can't back it up, Matthew was very concerned about God's morals, his divine law of morals and ethics. And he was in, I think, Ethiopia, yes. And he criticized the king for his lack of morals. And as a result of that, they stabbed him to death, according to church tradition. Could be right, could be wrong. But here's what I loved about Matthew. I loved reading his firsthand account of his time that he literally walked with Jesus. What Jesus told him were the most important things. And he does it with such great detail. It is 28 chapters long. I did it in one day, and I'm literally taking notes. Like as I was writing down everything in order and writing down which chapter it was in. It took me a day to do it. But I tell you what, that is one exciting book. So I hope that you now can read Matthew understanding he walked with Jesus. But now we move into Mark. Who was Mark? Well, Mark was Jewish and he was an evangelist, but he was not one of the 12 disciples. Like Matthew, who is Matthew and Levi, Mark has two names. Mark is his Roman name, and John is his Jewish name. In the Greco-Roman society, because the Roman Empire really spanned millions of square miles, it seemed like, they had two names. It was very customary to have a Hebrew name and to have a Roman name. So Mark has two names. His name is John Mark. And so sometimes you'll see John, and then sometimes you'll see John, who's also called Mark. Sometimes you'll just see Mark. Sometimes you'll see Marcus. And as a result, people think that there's a couple different Marks in the Bible. The lexicons disagree with that. They say John, Mark, and Marcus are all the same guy. But the confusing part is sometimes they don't say John, who's also called Mark. They just say John, and you're thinking it's the other John. So you got to read things in context, and you can figure out if it's Mark or not. But John Mark had a cousin. His cousin's name is Barnabas, and they both were companions of Paul. So they traveled around with Paul a lot. And for whatever reason, on one of the first missionary journeys, John Mark skips out. And it's in Acts 12:25, and it says, "And Barnabas and Saul returned from Jerusalem when they had fulfilled their mission, taking along with them John, who was called Mark." So now we know we're talking about Mark that wrote Mark, the Gospel of Mark in the Bible. Then you get into chapter 13 of Acts. I'm going to read verse 5 and 13. "And when they reached Salamis, they began to proclaim the word of God in the synagogues of the Jews. And they also had John as their helper." So we're thinking, John, John, the beloved disciple. Also had John as their helper. Verse 13, "Now Paul and his companion put out to sea from Paphos and came to Perge and Pamphylia, but John left them and returned to Jerusalem." You're thinking, John. This is John Mark that left. John Mark's mom had a home in Jerusalem, and a lot of the scholars think that that's probably where he went back to. She was a very prominent woman, and she held a lot of events, social events, and church meetings in her home. So they feel like maybe that's where Mark disappeared to. But later, Barnabas wants him to rejoin them on their missionary journeys, and Paul is not too keen on the idea because he ditched out on them earlier. So here's this interaction between Barnabas and Paul. Listen to what they call him in this verse. Acts 15:36 through 39. "After some days, Paul said to Barnabas, 'Hey, let us return and visit the brethren in every city in which we proclaimed the word of the Lord, and see how they are.' Well, Barnabas wanted to take John, called Mark, along with them also. But Paul kept insisting that they should not take him along, who had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not gone with them to the work. And there occurred such a sharp disagreement that they separated from one another. And Barnabas took Mark with him and sailed away to Cyprus." So one time, in one verse, 37, they call him John, who's called Mark, and then in verse 39, they just call him Mark. So you can see where people are getting confused of all these different... It's one guy, John Mark, wrote the book of Mark. And like I said, he wasn't one of the 12 disciples, so what qualified him to be able to write the life of Jesus? Apparently, when Simon Peter was imprisoned, and he had a death sentence over his head, and he was supposed to be killed the next morning. An angel let him out. And Peter could have gone anywhere, but Peter ends up going to John Mark's mother's house in Jerusalem. We read about it in Acts 12 through 17, and it says, and when he, Peter, realized this, that an angel had rescued him, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, who was also called Mark, where many were gathered together, and they were praying. When he, Peter, knocked on the door of the gate, a servant girl named Rhoda came to answer. Now, when she recognized Peter's voice, because of her joy, she didn't open the gate, but ran in and announced that Peter was standing in front of the gate. And they said to her, "You're out of your mind." But she kept insisting that it was so, and they kept saying, "It is this angel." But Peter continued knocking, and when they opened the door, they saw him, and they were amazed. But motioning to them with his hand to be silent, he described to them how the Lord had led him out of the prison. And he said, "Report these things to James and the brethren." And then he left and went another place. And I'm thinking, James and the brethren has got to be the disciples. Like the disciples met here. John Mark's mother's home was a place where they had church meetings, and possibly the disciples came and ministered. John Mark and Simon Peter were friends. They knew each other. And so scholars think and they believe that towards the end of Simon Peter's life that him and John Mark actually traveled together and ministered together in Rome. So where Matthew was written to the Jews, scholars believe that Mark was actually written to the Romans. And that's why Mark doesn't tie everything back to the Old Testament prophecies. The Romans wouldn't have any interest in that. John Mark doesn't do a genealogy. Romans wouldn't have any interest in that. Mark doesn't do a lot of the parables. Mark doesn't do hardly any of Jesus' teachings. He starts at Jesus' baptism. He skips over his birth, he skips over his childhood, he goes straight to his baptism, and then he just gets to rolling on stories. Story after stuff that would keep Roman people interested in the life of Jesus. And so Mark is the shortest of the Gospels, but it's the one that moves along very, very quickly with just story time. So there's a man named Papias, an early church father. Writing in 140 AD, he stated that Mark obtained much of the material for his gospel from stories related to him by Peter. Now, this statement has been accepted as reliable by most New Testament scholars. And like I said, they believe that in the latter part of Peter's life, these two even ministered together in Rome. So, I think this is important to understand this because it explains why Mark reads different than Matthew. That's one of the main questions I get from girls that I teach, at the shelter. They're like, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, weren't they all writing about Jesus' ministry? And I'm like, yes. Why do they all sometimes tell different stuff or leave stuff out? I just had a phone call the other night. They're like, how come John wrote about this and Mark didn't? And it's just because, first of all, you got Matthew, who's writing to the Jews, Mark, who's writing to the Romans, different audiences. You have Matthew, who walked firsthand with Jesus and telling stories from a firsthand perspective with his own memories, and Mark, who is supposedly penning Simon Peter's memories, and maybe stories that are heard at his mom's house when the prayer meetings were going on with some of the other disciples. So that's why these books read differently, and they focus on different things. They've got a different audience. So keep that in mind as you're reading through Mark. Some believe that Mark was written many years after the crucifixion while Nero was on the throne. Now Nero was 54 to 68. Nero's the one that sent Vespasian down to Jerusalem to surround the people in 66 AD. But in 64, Nero did something. He burned about 70% of Rome and blamed it on the Christians. And he used that event as an excuse for mass genocide of believers. And so he was responsible for Simon Peter's death. He was the one that put Paul to death, was Nero, and then Nero killed himself in 68. So a lot of people believe that Mark was written during Nero's reign because Mark is also warning of the signs of the end of the age, which everybody thought was going to happen in their lifetime. If Jerusalem had already been destroyed, which happened in 70 AD, Mark surely would have mentioned that. but he doesn't mention that. So they believe that his book was written before 70 AD in the reign of Nero. So if Mark, and this is what I found curious, because when I went through Mark, I did the same thing. I'm writing down every story in order in the chapter that it was in, and I'm tracking them with Matthew to see like if these guys are telling the same stories in the same order, and they're not. And then Mark doesn't tell half the stories that Matthew does. But what tweaked my brain the most, I'm thinking, okay, just if Mark actually got his information for the gospel from Peter's stories, then why did he leave out 3 stories about Peter? Peter would have told him everything. For instance, the story where the disciples are on the boat and the storm is just raging and Jesus walks out to the boat and they're like, it's a phantom. And then Peter says, Lord, if it's you, bid me to come out. And he gets out of the boat and he panics and he sinks. That's all in Matthew. You get to Mark and he leaves out the part where Peter got out of the boat. See how Mark tells the stories, there's this big storm and then Jesus walked out of the water and then he got in the boat. And that's it. Yeah. And I'm like, okay, Peter, was you embarrassed? Did you not tell Mark about the part? Or Mark, did you know that part and you didn't put it in for whatever reason? Or is it because the Romans don't need to know anything other than Jesus walks on water? And that's the most important thing. I don't know. I don't know why Mark didn't put in the part where Peter got out and sank if Peter's the one telling him the stories. Another one that got left out when Jesus asked his disciples, who do you say that I am? And Peter says, you are the Christ. And Jesus says, blessed be you, Peter. Man didn't reveal that to you. Your name means rock, and upon this rock I'm going to build my church. Okay, that's Matthew's rendition. Mark, he gets to the point where Peter says, you are the Christ, and then the story's over. There's nothing about Jesus responding, nothing about your name means rock, there's nothing. It's just, you are the Christ, and then the story continues with something else. And I'm thinking, well, Mark, why didn't you mention that about? Because that's like a good thing for Peter. The other one's a little embarrassing, but like this is a good one. The third one, when they're in Capernaum and Jesus tells Mark to go and get a fish and then open the fish's mouth and there's a coin in there where you can pay your taxes. Matthew tells that story. Mark doesn't even tell that story at all. And you would think Peter would tell him that was really cool. Like went down, caught a fish, and it's like a coin. Mark doesn't even tell that story at all. And then in the book of Luke, when I got to Luke and I'm like tracking all of his stories, Luke tells a story when Jesus gets into the boats to preach to the people and he tells Simon Peter to throw his net over, and Simon Peter's like, yeah, we've been fishing all day, didn't catch nothing. But he throws it over anyway, and then the nets get so full of fish they start to tear. That's Luke's rendition. Mark doesn't mention it. So I'm thinking, it just caught me as curious that if Mark got all of his information from Simon Peter, why didn't some of these stories make it into his book? But guess what? They made it in Matthew. And a lot of them made it in Luke. That's why I'm like, don't just read one gospel and think, oh, I got it. Boy, if you miss some of these 3 gospels, like by the time you're done reading the 3 and you find all these pieces and parts that go together, at the end, you have a puzzle with all the pieces in it. Right. If you skip over one of them, you miss some really good stuff. And I say, if you've not read any of them, I would say, me personally, I would say start with Mark, because sometimes the attention span is short. Mark is stories. But then when you read Matthew, you're going to recognize some of the stories, but with greater detail and more stories. And then you get into some extra parables. And then when you read Luke, you get a whole lot more stories and more details. So that's just my take on the order that I would choose to read them in. Now, here's one thing that Mark does. He includes the warning of the end of the age to the Romans. If he's writing to the Romans, he includes it in chapter 13. Romans thought that it would happen in their lifetime as well. There was Roman Christians in Jerusalem when Cestius Gallus came down from Syria that escaped with the Jewish Christians. Not one Roman Christian died in the attack of Jerusalem, thanks to Mark's warnings that he penned in Mark 13. So now, according to tradition, John Mark, how he died. Like I said, it's not in the Bible, so we have to go by church tradition. He was in Alexandria, Egypt, where he was converting Egyptians to Christianity. And it says in the year 68 AD is when he died. So he penned his book before that. It is believed that the pagans who were furious at him for converting the Egyptian people to Christianity put a noose around his neck and dragged him through the city until he died. Can't validate that, but that is church tradition. So I say after all this man went through, to bring us the gospel of Jesus, the life of Jesus, through the eyes of good old Simon Peter, and possibly some of the disciples that met at his mother's house. And if you like a short story that reads really good, that's like the Reader's Digest condensed version of Jesus' ministry, say Mark is a must read. Must read that book. All right, now Luke, we're going to hit Luke. Luke is not a disciple either. Even though we hear his name, he's got one of the Gospels. He was not one of the original 12. Now, some people think he was part of the 70, but he wasn't part of the original 12. Nor was he a Jew. Believe it or not, Luke was believed to be a Greek, a Gentile. And his audience was the lower class people in Greece and Rome. I really enjoy reading his book. It is the longest of the Gospels, but it beats Matthew by a word count a little bit. But to me, Luke gives so much detail, the kind of stuff that I love. He also wrote the book of Acts. And between Luke and Acts, he wrote more of the New Testament word-wise than even Paul did. Paul wrote a whole bunch of books, but word count-wise, Luke and Acts together ends up being the majority of the New Testament. Now, he addressed Luke and Acts to a man named Theophilus. And nobody seems to know, can't pinpoint who this Theophilus is. But both books were written to this man. And they believe that he was a Gentile. And Luke's purpose in writing was to make sure that Theophilus knew that everything that he had been taught was trustworthy and true. And so when he writes his book, he puts in so many details and dates and people's names and where they ruled that you can look in history books and you can actually figure out when certain stories happened based on who was in the throne in what city, because Luke is an amazing historian. So one thing about his books being the longest, why are they the longest? He added names of prominent people in areas that they ruled, and he added 19, I counted, there's probably more that I missed, 19 more stories than Matthew added. So if you don't read Luke, you're going to miss some really popular stories. You're like, oh, only Luke wrote about that. And I'm going to go over some of those later. Where Matthew gave us Jesus' legal bloodline, Luke gave us his biological bloodline. Right. Where Matthew started at Abraham and went down to Jesus, Luke works it backwards. He starts at Jesus and he goes all the way back to God. To Adam, who was the Son of God. But what is confusing in Luke is at the beginning it says that Jesus was supposedly the son of Joseph. Joseph, the son of Heli. Well, in Matthew it says Joseph was the son of Jacob. And so you're like, how can you have two daddies? In the Bible, you will very rarely find the word son-in-law, grandson, stepson. They use the word son. The Hebrew word is bane. The Greek word is huios. And so they use the word son even though it might be a stepson or son-in-law. So in this particular Luke 3, Joseph is the son-in-law of Heli. Heli is Mary's daddy. And so this is the biological bloodline that's Mary's bloodline. And the father of that bloodline is the Holy Spirit. And it'll take you up through Nathan, the son of King David, not Solomon. Nathan, the son of King David. And then it'll take you all the way back to Adam, the son of God. So that's history for you. And that's what Luke is really good at. He is amazing with his history. So Luke is a doctor. He's a physician. He travels with Paul. And so one of the things that I find fitting is that he got to log the world's first virgin birth. It must have been fascinating as a physician to log the virgin birth. And then he's one of the only ones that tells us how John the Baptist came into the picture. Talks about how John the Baptist was born and the story behind his daddy and what all happened there. Matthew and Mark don't do that. Luke gives us the story of Lazarus and the rich man that both die and they both go into Hades.
Right.
One goes to paradise, which is the upper realm of Hades. One goes to the lower depths. And then they're like having this somehow a communication in the realm of Hades. And everybody's just like, okay, there's this great gulf between them and nobody can go back and forth. Okay, he's the only one that writes about that. It's a very comprehensive look at the realm of where dead people, disembodied spirits went. If you don't read Luke, you would never get to read that story. Luke also tells us about the prodigal son, the only one. Prodigal son's a huge story. It's only in Luke. He's the only one that tells the story of Mary and Martha. He's the only one that tells the story of the Good Samaritan. So you've got to read all three because there's stuff in each one of these. Like I said, they all dovetail together and make this amazing picture. So one thing that Luke gives us is information about the date that Jesus was baptized. Jesus was baptized. Now we know his birth was logged at 5-4 BC. When he was baptized, Luke 3, verse 1, it says it was the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius, the Roman emperor. So if we know when Roman Emperor Tiberius began his reign, he was in the 15th year of his reign. And then it says that in Luke 3, verse 3 and 21, that John the Baptist was going around, he was baptizing people. And then Jesus came and Jesus got baptized. So in the 15th year of Tiberius, Jesus is getting baptized. Well, then in Luke 3:23, it says Jesus was about 30 years old when he began his public ministry. So between these 4 verses, we can deduce when Jesus was baptized, and it should confirm that he was born in 5-4 BC. And so the tricky part about it is Tiberius actually reigned by himself in 14 AD. Well, if Jesus was almost 30 in the 15th year of Tiberius's reign, let's just say 14 was year 1, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28. It would mean Jesus was almost 30 years old in 28 AD. But the math doesn't add up. Because if you subtract that, that would make him born in 2 BC, and he wasn't born in 2 BC because Herod was already dead in 4 BC. So I started doing some research. I'm like, the Bible doesn't contradict itself. We're missing something. Come to find out that Tiberius co-reigned with his stepfather Augustus starting in 12 AD, and he had every, as a co-regent, he had every honor of the emperor status put on him in 12, not 14. So when you take 12 being his first year and you add 15 to it, it takes you to 26 AD. Jesus was baptized either at the very end of 26 AD in the fall or at the cusp of the new year at the beginning of 27 AD. Remember, their New Year switches over in September. But if you take, he's almost 30 and 26, and you do the math backwards, that would make him be born around 4 BC, which confirms with the Strong's Concordance, 4-5 BC. So I love things like that. That's the kind of things we're trying to track down. In fact, here's what's cool. Jesus could have been a New Year's baby. Because if the Strong's is like it's either 5 or 4, 5 or 4. Well, what is it, 5 or 4? Well, if he was born on New Year's Day, it would be 4 BC.
The Lord started all over with Jesus.
If he was born the night before, in September, it would have been 5 BC. And that's why the Strong's is like 5-4 BC. He's somewhere right around New Year's, guys, I believe his birth is.
Wow.
How fitting. And then his baptism, it says, the Strong says he was baptized in 27. I'm like, well, maybe he was baptized on New Year's Day as well. One day before that would have been 26. So we're just a matter of days apart. Either way, thanks to Luke telling us the 15th year of Tiberius, we're good. But Luke's gospel is filled with meticulous details like that. And so you can really track a lot of dates of when these stories took place if you know, if you read the book of Luke. Now, he also wrote Acts. Guys, Acts is like a continuation of the story of Christ. Luke ends with Christ ascending. Acts starts with Christ ascending. And then Acts picks up what happened after Christ went back to heaven. Well, he sent out his apostles. Well, what happened to them? Read the book of Acts. It's one big story of what it looked like to try to plant a church and spread the gospel in the first century. And it wasn't pretty. These men literally laid down their lives. They got imprisoned. They got beat. Everything to try to build the church back then. We think it's hard being a Christian now. Well, we had no idea. So, where did Luke, because if Luke wasn't one of the 12 and Luke wasn't even Jewish, how did Luke get his information to write 2 of the longest books in the Bible? They say that he got his information, first of all, from Mark. So they knew each other. They must travel together. He got his information from the quotes of Jesus, those sayings of Jesus that were very well known in the church, and that he traveled with Paul. Paul, who wrote basically the next biggest portion of the New Testament. And most of Acts is stories about Paul. And so Luke is basically telling us, it's like he's traveling along and he's writing down the stories of Paul's life, of Peter's life, of these different apostles that were sent out. And because he is an amazing historian, guys, people today are finding things that they need to know, like, oh, is this artifact really from this time in this era because it looks like it's from this dynasty? They'll go back and read Luke's stuff, and it'll prove that his history is immaculately impeccable, perfect. So I would highly encourage you to read the book of Luke, just because he's got a lot of good stuff in there. So where Matthew was written to the Jews, Mark was written to the Romans, they believe Luke was written to the lower class Greeks and Romans. One thing about the Greco-Roman society back then is that the Romans and the Greeks were very class conscious, which means the upper class basically ruled everything, and the lower class were basically helpless to improve their state. And citizenship was restricted. In fact, if you look at the old cities, they would build them on hills. The upper class lived at the top with all these, amphitheaters and libraries, and then they had a wall. And then the next lower class people lived further down the hill, and they were like your workers, people that could sustain themselves, that had, kiosks where they sell leather or whatever, those kind of industrial, kind of those people. But they weren't allowed up through the gate of the other people's place. It was restricted. You were class restricted. And then the lower class was down here. And at nights, the upper class, they'd lock the gate. So there's no way anybody could get in that didn't belong. So what Luke is saying is, this salvation message goes all the way to the lowest class of people. Jesus isn't turned away by the poor and the needy. In fact, you're very, very important to him. And those lower class people needed to hear that. And Luke even put the warning in there for the end of the age. But he didn't say, when the abomination of desolation is spoken of by Daniel, you see it and then you flee. Those people wouldn't have known. They're Gentile people. They wouldn't have known of the prophecy. He simply told them, when you see Jerusalem being surrounded, desolation is near. And as a result of Luke warning the lower class people, the Christians in Jerusalem escaped as well as the Roman Christians, as well as the Jewish Christians. These letters are all written to different categories of people, but we get to be blessed by all of them. So Luke traveled with Paul. Luke wrote a lot of Paul's story. And so if you want to know what it was like to be a disciple or a Christian back then in the first century, I would say definitely don't miss the book of Acts. Alrighty. History states that Paul that wrote a much part of the New Testament, he was killed by Nero. And so thanks to Luke, we have his stories live on. Simon Peter was killed by Nero. Thanks to Mark, we have Simon Peter's stories that live on. I just say, I hope that by tonight, I'm just kind of giving you a taste of each of these people and each of their books, but I hope that after tonight, when you open up their books and you read them, if you didn't already know this before, you know a little bit more about their history, that the books will come alive, because hands down, the Bible is the best book on the market, in my opinion. Amen? Amen. I love you guys. Thank you so much for letting me share this night with you. I'm going to go ahead and close in prayer.